a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, listeners. This is Brooke with a quick reminder that I have two amazing memoir classes coming up this spring. The first one is The Story of You, which I've shared about the last couple weeks, featuring Kiese Lehman, Mark Nepo, Joshua Moore, and Susan Liu as the extraordinary teachers that you will not want to miss. That one starts on March 4th and will be focused on tapping into discovery, inspiration, and ways to connect to yourself and your writing during these challenging times. Right after that class, Linda Joy Myers and I will be teaching What Made Maggie Smith's You Could Make This Place Beautiful a best-selling memoir. This is a 4-week class that starts on April 22nd. If you loved this book, and honestly, who didn't, join us to understand why it struck the nerve it did and how Maggie Smith's writing and her execution can impact your own writing and execution in ways that deepen what you're trying to achieve. This is part of our best-selling memoir series where we teach writers to be better memoirists by studying the works of great writers who've come before you, and this one is just $99. So check out the details for both classes at magicofmemoir.com. Hope to see you there.
Hello, writers of the intimate, the domestic, the mundane, the quotidian, the boring, subjects that often hold the most dramatic of dramas, especially when the stories take place in seemingly pastoral and peaceful suburbs. I'm here with my co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm particularly excited about today's show because it features one of my favorite authors of all time, Tom Perrotta, who I initially discovered actually through his movies based on his books, most notably Election with Matthew Broderick and an iconic performance by Reese Witherspoon, and then Little Children with Kate Winslet, and both films were nominated for Oscars. And then I'm also excited because Tom is noted for being a master of the suburban novel, and it's been so interesting for me to pause and reflect on the suburban novel, which is a very particular American genre when I think about it. There are so many classics of the form and iconic characters. I'm thinking of Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road, John Updike's Rabbit series, nearly all of John Cheever's work, Richard Ford's Independence Day and his character Frank Bascom, who's a recurring character, and then Jonathan Franzen's Corrections, Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere, and A.M. Holmes' Music for Torching, just to name a handful that come to mind. So it's a great theme in American literature. And I wish I could actually pause my life right now to either teach a class on the suburban novel or take one after listing all of those. I want to read them and compare them. I don't know. I didn't realize what a big place the suburban novel has taken in my reading life because all of those books made an impact on me. And I'm not even touching on the many great TV shows about the suburbs. So I'm curious, Brooke, what about you? What role do the suburbs play in either your reading life or your real life or both? Because I find that everyone has a reaction to the suburban life.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm from the suburbs myself, but I honestly hadn't really given all that much thought to the idea of the suburban novel. But of course, I've been very taken by them, and I've read several of the ones that you just listed. Also a huge fan of Tom Perrotta's. But what I like about the topic generally is that it's this investigation of something that you said is very quotidian, right? I mean, it's like, it reminds me of the domestic novel, which sometimes gets short shrifted, I guess, as not lofty in some kind of way. I was thinking about, that women writers have historically elevated the domestic novel. Tom Perrotta, in my opinion, and we're going to get to this in the interview with him a little bit, is someone who is known to write women characters very well. So I'm glad we're going to unpack that with him a little bit. And also he's known for writing well about the hidden tensions between seemingly ordinary communities, which maybe is his specialty, right? So I guess if I was going to say something about how this kind of fiction has touched me or what I think about it, is just that it matters tremendously that we have novels that touch upon ordinary lives, and that maybe they're my favorite kinds of novels. After all, this is where we spend most of our time, right? Ordinary days with ordinary people. And I was thinking about how I spend most of my conversations with my teenage son, James, talking about all the people in his life and the interdynamics of the kids that he hangs out with. And I see how his mind and his self is growing and maturing, because of how he makes sense of people's behaviors, right? And how he interacts with them. And to me, probably because I'm the daughter of two psychologists, I just think this is endlessly fascinating. The dynamics and human interactions that are at the core of these kinds of suburban domestic storylines just really do it for me, I guess is the way I'd put it.
I know, me too. And I think one thing about the American suburb is that, even though they're created as a type of utopia with new nice houses and schools and parks, and they're away from urban grit, the American suburbs also portrayed as the place dreams go to die. And you'll notice from my list of notable suburban books that many or most of them have been written by white American men. And there's a common theme in all of them that the men who end up in the suburbs are essentially crippled by their own privileges. Their material prosperity and or their marriages become an odd form of oppression. And it's as if they're victims of the American dream, essentially, shut off from their more spiritual or manly or adventurous sides. And I'm kind of curious if the authors of these novels are actually projecting their own fears on suburban lives, because writers, they tend not to seek out the suburban life. And if people in the suburbs view themselves as maybe more fulfilled and less frustrated than they appear on the page. Maybe those suburban dads actually like coaching Little League baseball. Maybe they're not all getting drunk and having illicit affairs with a neighbor. But that said, I like to write about small town life for the same reason, that the smallness of a place, it can both hem people in, and then it can also magnify their sins and frustrations and their ennui because of that, fishbowl quality of the place, or that's what I actually experienced growing up in a small town. I always say it's an ideal dramatic setting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And when you think about it, suburbs attract a lot of stories about sexually repressed and unfulfilled people, and those play well on the screen. I mean, Tom Perrotta's books, as you've said, have been made into Oscar-nominated films, but we've also seen that with movies like American Beauty, which might be the ultimate suburban drama, The Ice Storm, which is based on Rick Moody's novel, and then, of course, very famously, The Virgin's Suicide, which is based on a novel by Jeffrey Eugenides. All of these novels are centered in a general American repression and sexual repression in particular. So to me, it's really interesting to think about the ways that suburban stories are really perhaps a significant subgenre and play really largely into the American imagination, perhaps because the suburbs and, the stories that come out of them are relatively new. It is like a post-World War II phenomenon, the suburbs. So it hasn't been around all that long. And yet, many of us are products of the suburbs and sort of reckoning with the realities of what it feels like to grow up in those places, to live in those places. And I per your question, Grant, about whether authors might be projecting their own struggles with middle class life onto suburbs, there's proof of that going all the way back to Edith Wharton's essay, The Great American Novel, which she wrote in 1927. In that piece, she laments her fellow writers' preoccupation with the little suburban house at number 1,000,010 Volstead Avenue, and deplored the aesthetic of deficiencies of the safe and uniform life found within it. And she called it a poor stimulus for the artist's imagination. So, just going back to the domestic and the fact that women have also wrestled with, the deadening possibilities of the suburban promise ever since the beginning. And certainly we saw that in 50s housewives and beyond. And so this has been a true American love-hate relationship, I think, with the suburbs for lots of years. Yeah.
And who would guess, to talk with Edith Wharton from my perspective now, that they're actually a stimulus to the artist's imagination, given our whole genre that's been created around them. Anyway, I used to get frustrated because people I met in the city would call my little hometown a suburb. And I was always very conscious of my hometown as a place with a history going back generations, and a place that wasn't attached to a city, but was its own thing. And that's what defines a suburb to me. They're not as rooted in a place, and they often don't have so much of a unique personality. And then they're part of a larger network of towns and cities, and they're relatively new. And I think that's what makes them so dramatic for storytellers. They're this web of cul-de-sacs, and often all the houses were built in the same period. So there's a homogeneous aesthetic that can be portrayed as without a distinct personality or style. And I think that's what Wharton was actually getting at way back in 1927. So, it's the unfulfilled yearning of a character, which Tom talks about talked about when we interviewed him, that it has that dramatic backdrop of the suburb, shallow roots combined with the veneer of happiness, combined with a conventional and somewhat judgmental moral code, combined with a restless soul. And that equals a riveting American drama, Brooke. You can't go wrong with that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's definitely an interesting psychological homelessness that some of these suburban characters wrestle with. And, perhaps it's because of that rootlessness of place that you mentioned. So many of the novels that you mentioned, and certainly some that Tom have written, wrestle with adultery and alcohol and, the characters search for fulfillment. And then that leads to self-destruction in a lot of cases. My favorite, many people's favorite, but the book that turned me on to Tom Perrotta was Little Children, which I read when it came out. And for those who've read it or haven't, in the book, Sarah and Todd are two stay-at-home parents not married to each other who live a seemingly perfect suburban life, right, in a suburban neighborhood. And of course, they begin an affair as a way to escape their own unsatisfying marriages. And, it does make me think that one of the major themes of this kind of fiction is the search for meaning, usually among middle-class people. And Tom's going to speak to that as well, right? There is a certain privilege inherent in all of this. And then I think it makes people wonder, like, why are we so unhappy? If everything is perfect, right? And that's just something that many people are wrestling with right now. And I was thinking it's because adulting is hard, middle age is hard, aging is hard, being a parent is hard. And so it does happen that we try to search for something outside of ourselves. And then sometimes that does invariably lead to self-destruction. And I was thinking about a book you mentioned earlier, A.M. Holmes's Music for Torching, where she has a Westchester couple burn down their house out of boredom and self-loathing. So that's a worthwhile story to read. And we had A.M. on the show a long time ago.
Yeah.
And that perhaps that's the rub right there for us. I can't speak to other countries, but certainly in the States, because the suburbs makes this big promise of happiness and a prosperous life, but the discontent looms large. And these novels really capture how no matter where we go, Grant, we bring our disconnect and our yearning for someplace better, I guess.
That's definitely true. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Blaise Pascal, who said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." So I don't know if he meant a suburban room, but it's appropriate for this discussion. So we'll talk about discontent, yearning, suburbs, writing, and more with Tom Perrotta after this very short break. Welcome back, everybody. I'm super excited to introduce one of my favorite authors, Tom Perrotta. Tom is the best-selling author of 10 works of fiction, including Election and Little Children, both of which were made into Oscar-nominated films, and The Leftovers, which was adapted into a critically acclaimed Peabody Award-winning HBO series. His other books include Bad Haircut, The Wishbones, Joe College, The Abstinence Teacher, 9 Inches, Mrs. Fletcher, and Tracy Flick Can't Win. And his work has been translated into a bunch of different languages, and he grew up in New Jersey and lives outside of Boston. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Grant and Brooke.
Absolutely. Well, you're often referred to as one of the masters of the suburban novel. And the suburban novel, I think it's a particularly American genre, since suburbs, generally promise something like the American dream, a nice house and a nice community and nice schools and nice yards, except they also tend to breed a lot of not niceness, at least in novels. And they're full of malaise and restlessness and the trouble that ensues. So I was wondering if you could tell us about your attraction to the drama of the suburbs.
Well, maybe I'll start first by expressing my own sense of, what's the right word, bemusement that I have become considered to be a novelist of the suburbs. I remember when it first happened was with the book Little Children, because before that I had been pigeonholed either as like a sort of working class writer from New Jersey or along with Nick Hornby in a kind of lad lit space. And Little Children was the first time I wrote with a woman main character. And I really felt like I was writing about a time of life, which was, young parenthood and sort of the real arrival of adulthood with its, responsibilities and a certain kind of sadness that comes when your life gets defined and limited. And I remember I went on Fresh Air again. Everything was happening. Like that was my breakout book. And I prepared rigorously for this interview with Terry Gross. I just thought, this is the biggest moment in my career. And I just tried to game out all the questions and prepare my answers so I could sound like somebody who'd, given his work some thought. And the first question was, exactly, you said, what is it about the suburbs?
Sorry, Tom.
And I was just thinking, the suburbs, that was the last thing on my mind. I was writing about a time of life. I was writing about, sexuality and transgression, and the way that the boundary for what was transgressive had been changing dramatically in the course of my life. But, what I realized was, of course, I live in the suburbs now. I grew up in the suburbs. I had like a lot of, writers my age. I did a little stint in New York, but I was never really home there. So home for me has always been the suburbs. And I think I was just doing that thing of, that's where my imagination resides. And so everything I have to say about people often comes out in the form of a story set in the suburbs. But I think I'm writing about people and they happen to be living in the suburbs, rather than I'm writing about the suburbs and that defines the people. And that's why, when you said malaise and restlessness and disappointments, I just feel like that's no surprise, right? People struggle to find meaning in their lives wherever they live, and those circumstances change. But to me, that's just the circumstantial part of it. Though I agree with what you said at the top. There is a sense that in America, that's the place where you want to go, and that's the place where successful lives happen, And I think if your life feels disappointing in some sense in a place where you're supposed to feel fulfilled, then there is a kind of special sadness. I'm sure there's an urban version of that, where you get everything that you think you're supposed to want, and it doesn't maybe satisfy you emotionally in a way that you expected. I think that's like the basis for stories, it's just people who need more,
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly my read on it, that it's basically just the disappointment of becoming an adult. It's hard.
Can't escape it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'll confess, I read Little Children, exactly when you were breaking out. Of course, it made a huge splash, and I hadn't read your previous books. And so you came on my radar at that time, like for most people, I'm sure. And you mentioned that was the first time you wrote a female protagonist with Sarah. And then I kind of feel like you've become known for being a dude who writes women really well. And so I'm curious if you feel that way. I love lad lit, that's very funny because somehow, even though I'm familiar with chick lit, I didn't know that term.
I don't think it really caught on, but for a while there was like a table at Barnes and Noble with lad lit. And I was very surprised to find myself there.
That's very funny. Yeah. So say more about writing a female protagonist. And has that been, after you wrote Sarah, was it something that you were conscious of wanting to do in future books?
Well, that's been an interesting path, because I think I had Little Children, and then I followed The Abstinence Teacher, whose main character is a woman who's a sex education teacher. And The Leftovers, I think, is a special case in all sorts of ways. So I won't count that. But to me, there was like a trilogy of Little Children, Abstinence Teacher, and Mrs. Fletcher that were my books that really explicitly were my attempt to imagine the lives of my female contemporaries, because I think I went to college in the early 80s, and it was really with like the first generation of young women who were raised to be feminist, or raised in a culture where feminism was a real, I think, had gone mainstream. And so I think they were all sort of imagining like, okay, we can do whatever we want now. The strictures that were on our mothers are lifted in a sense. And, you can be the president, and you can be a doctor, and you can be a soldier and an athlete, whatever it was. And then I think, when people started to get married and have kids, suddenly the other model where, the husband went out and worked, and, that whole issue of how do you share parenthood, and how do you have a marriage in which both people get to be all things, and men weren't always on board, I think, in the way that women thought that they would be, So that was part of what I was was trying to address. Mrs. Fletcher was very specifically addressing this more recent earthquake in terms of gender and sexuality and the way that it gets expressed and acted out in the culture. And, I think that I got a lot of good feedback. I often would go to, readings or, visit with book clubs where the readers are primarily women. And it was very, it was to me really rewarding and gratifying to have women come up and say to me like, oh, I was Tracy Flick in high school, or, I know exactly how that felt. But I do think around the time of Me Too and a kind of just that feeling of like, I was interesting for a while because I was a man who wrote about women. And then I think there was a little bit of a pushback, just some sense of like, well, even if you're telling an interesting story, or getting it right, there are lots of women who can tell that story better than you. I feel like the climate has changed a little bit in terms of that, and I don't really know how to defend it except to say, one of the things that the novel does is to imagine groups of people together. You can't write about a family if you can't write across gender lines. You can't write about just about any social situation if you can't write across gender lines. And I do have a kind of, I'm not an autofictionist. I write about, relationships and communities and workplaces. And so, I understand where the critique is coming from. I just,
well, largely, I want to just say, I understand there might have been some backlash, but you stand out in my mind and my memory as someone who is praised for writing women well. So I hope you can take that away from this.
Oh yeah, no, I do. It's been interesting to see I've been lucky to have a long career, and I've been able to see the way, the context in which I write has evolved.
Right. That makes sense.
That's interesting. That kind of reframes the question I was just about to ask, but maybe we can just kind of go with that. I believe I read that you discovered John Updike's series of rabbit novels in your teens, or around then, at least.
I was a little late to the rabbit books. I was already in graduate school.
Oh, okay.
And it was the very first, Rabbit Run was the very first audiobook I ever listened to. I was driving from Syracuse back to my parents' place in New Jersey. And I had, this thing from the library that had like 10 cassettes in it,
Yes,
and it was
I remember.
read by this just terrible reader. He was like the guy who did like newsreels in high school. Like when you'd get like a newsreel about history, the guy had like a completely exaggerated voice, and very sexist reading, like Janice, Rabbit's wife was like, Harry, but nonetheless, and I remember just this ride, which had seemed endless to me in other times that I've done it. Suddenly it was like, I got home and I didn't want to leave the car, it's just like deep into rabbit land. And, but sorry, you didn't even get to your question.
No, I actually loved it as a detour because I'm actually on a book tour right now on the road, and I'm thinking, I got to get the re-listen or reread Rabbit through audio.
I hope somebody has redone it because that early one, it was like I think it was like books on tape, probably for visually impaired people.
Okay, I'm gonna look for it on eBay and see what I can come up with. But Rabbit was a big character for me. I actually discovered it the first novel when I was in my teens and read them all. And getting back to the suburbs, I didn't live in the suburbs, so those books kind of were this view into the suburbs. But like you said, it's more about you got to witness this man aging and living through marriage and parenthood and more. And I kind of always thought I'd develop a character like Rabbit who I'd return to as a writer, but I haven't. No one's really spoken to me like that. But you have really in Tracy Flick, and she's, not just a simple character, but an iconic female archetype like Rabbit. And so I think it's interesting that you were saying that like women could write this character better maybe, but you've already, created this iconic character. And I was just curious, since you've now written a follow-up novel, if she is kind of your Rabbit, will you return to her?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd never had that urge before with any of my characters. And it was once a pretty common thing. Roth had his recurring characters and Updike, and I'm sure there are others if I thought about it. With Tracy Flick specifically, I think it was, in a way, it's a wonderful thing for a writer. This character kind of got away from me. I wrote this book. It was quite an obscure book, and then it became a sort of cult movie, and then the character kind of escaped from the bounds of the movie and became part of a political discourse. And I was kind of watching in a very intrigued way to, when people started to talk about, hey, wait a second, Tracy Flick isn't a villain. She isn't this despicable character, and again, this was part of that moment around probably the years that prefigured Me Too, just this sense of, people looking back at the kind of sexist world that, we all grew up in, and starting to say, wait a second, why is this girl who was, sexually victimized by her teacher, why is she considered the villain and the obnoxious person? And people are always like the villain. She's a great villain of, you can still see it on the internet. There are like 10 great female villains, mm-hmm. And it's sort of like, wow, she's a high school kid who wants to get elected president. She does do a few, morally questionable things, but her, her teachers do things way worse. But somehow in the 90s and early 2000s, people would watch that movie and just accept the teacher's sense that like Tracy is a problem that needs to be stopped, and Tracy's one of the main characters of the book, but arguably it's Mr. M's book, Election. It has seven first person narrators. So I had to try to see the world from everybody's point of view, including Tracy's. And I think, I found ways to, I think Tracy is kind of a touching character in some ways. She's full of ambition. She's raised by a single mom. She doesn't have the same, economic privilege that a lot of people around her have, so there's that resentment that comes from being a little bit marginal, but also having this sense of I've got some place to go and some important things to do. But anyway, it was very interesting for me to see like Tracy being rethought and, revised by critics. And I did feel like a little bit of discomfort because Tracy has an affair with a teacher and she's absolutely adamant that she is not a victim in the book, that she was in some sense in charge of that interaction. And that when she decided that it wasn't working for her, she basically walked away from it. Everything she did that because she wanted to do it, and she put a stop to it. And she's asserting a narrative that says, I had agency. And one of the things that happened in that Me Too moment was a lot of women pushed back and said, that agency was an illusion, that the real power was in the hands of the authority figure, the teacher, the man. And I made that like sort of the explicit question of Tracy Flick Can't Win, which is Tracy re-examining her life through the lens of these ideas that are in the culture. Because I think earlier feminism really did put a lot of emphasis on the agency of women.
Yeah.
And for Tracy to get where she wanted, she really needed to feel that she was a powerful person in the world. And I think that it was really went against her grain to think of herself as a victim. And so the book was just really like I was letting Tracy do as a fictional character what I had to do as a writer, which was to think like, oh, I wrote it that way. It really seemed true to the spirit of that time and who that girl would be then, but how would she feel now? And so it was really an attempt to kind of engage with, just the way that our interpretation of our life changes because of the cultural context around it.
It's an interesting opportunity, actually. I mean, I love that you've done that, and the world has changed so much around that topic specifically. So, well, Tom, I'm going to pivot to the next question because this is a podcast for writers. And so we often talk about writers' journeys and creative processes. And in an interview, you said, looking back now, it seems like I spent about 15 years learning the craft of writing and finding a voice that worked for me. And so I'm curious about those first 15 years, if you'd take us back a little bit. You're someone who identifies with more of like a plain language school of writing, not aspiring to be overly artsy or literary. So in those early years, did that effort show up, in a desire to be more literary? And what did it mean to find a voice that worked for you?
Yeah, I think I probably said a lot of different things about writing. I think, like a lot of people, I had to go through those periods of imitating other writers. So I've really loved as a young person, Kafka, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There was a kind of tradition of, dreamlike, non-realistic fiction that meant a lot to me. And at the same time, I remember, when I read Raymond Carver in college, that was kind of and this is not unique to me, but just there's just some kind of sense of recognition because, I had grown up in a very working class world, and my parents hadn't gone to college, and a lot of the people, I grew up with hadn't. And I felt very uncomfortable with the idea that I was going to write stuff that they wouldn't want to read. I just had this kind of democratic impulse that I could write not just for a literary audience, but for a broader audience. But I was sort of torn between literature is a sophisticated undertaking, and I felt like Carver showed me a way, because those stories seem so simple, but when you get into them, they're just layers and layers, and they reward all kinds of repeated readings, and you keep finding new things in them. So I think it was just a matter of figuring out what to write. Like I had a college writing teacher. I wrote about the town I grew up in, and he's like, "Oh, this is quite good, but it's time for you to branch out, do something bigger than that." So he was like pushing me to not so much write what I know, which is one of those dilemmas for everybody. And I think, I was lucky because I went to Syracuse, and Tobias Wolff was my teacher. And when I wrote the first story that would later become Bad Haircut, my first book, he's just like, yes, like more of this, he just felt like it was a quantum leap from what I was doing before, which maybe was closer to the kind of suburban fiction that you would have found in the New Yorker at the time, but was about a suburban world that I didn't actually know. It was almost more like I was writing out of just what I had read before rather than, what I had lived. And so and eventually I did get back to that world, like around little children. So it's all of a piece, but somehow to find my voice as whatever that means, it did mean that I had to kind of root my fiction in the world that I'd grown up in.
I'm going to ask another writing process question, Tom. We've talked a lot on this show about word count goals, and I think that comes largely because I used to be executive director of National Novel Writing Month, where word count goals were a big thing. And I read where you said you've never been able to really write consistently, even at the clip of Graham Greene, who wrote, he'd write exactly 500 words per day. I've always been fascinated by that. And that you really just focus on trying to write something new every day. And I work with writing students really at all levels. And lately, instead of, emphasizing word count goals, I've just been emphasizing just keeping the momentum going, no matter what momentum means. And I think a writer has to kind of define what that is. And it sounds like that's what you do, is just making sure you're moving forward every day and focus on keeping momentum. So I was wondering if that's true. Can you speak more to that as a daily process?
I like the way you put that about momentum, because that is important. I think my first book, Bad Haircut, was short stories. And I remember just sometimes I would spend hours just revising what I had. And that's an important part of writing. But if that's all you do, you're going to kind of get stuck. Mm-hmm. And so at a certain point, I just realized, and I think it was around the time my wife and I started having kids, and my writing time became quite precious. And I just realized, like, I can't just spend this 3-hour period that I have right now, which is so precious, revising. And so even though I would often begin my session editing what I had done at the last session, I wouldn't let myself leave until there was a sort of blurt of something new at the end. And sometimes if I'm lucky, that's in the hundreds of words. Sometimes it's, a paragraph, but I just feel like I have gotten farther down the road than I was when I started. And that has served me well. I've just never been able, I'm so jealous when people say, like, oh, I just sat down and I forgot where I was and I wrote for 5 hours. Like it's like people telling you how great the sex they have is, it's like, oh, God, good for you. I've never had that experience.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, you also made me laugh when you're like, I've said a lot of things over the years, because I pulled another line from you that read, I believe that the basic human condition is to be a bystander of disaster. I think a lot of people feel that way, especially right now, the disaster part, the helplessness part. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how it works for you as a storyteller?
Yeah, boy, I think I've later put the asterisk on that and say that's one of the more, that's what you say if you're a very fortunate person, which for many of, middle-class people in America over the course of my lifetime, yeah, we've been really fortunate. I sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night these days and realize, like, oh, maybe we're not bystanders anymore. There's so many different disasters, whether they're natural disasters or the political nightmare that we're living through right now. But I did think, that's part of just the media landscape that we live in, right? And I think it's why kids are so anxious and just to have 24-hour access to everything that's going wrong in the world. It just places a huge burden on us. And I don't think we've figured out how to deal with it. I mean, when you read like the number of hours like the average American kid spends like scrolling through a phone, and that phone can just be, oh, there's a dance, but there's also just like, people talking about their eating disorders, or people talking about, political disasters or natural disasters. I think it's just a huge burden to be a bystander or a witness and try to figure out, well, how do I live my life? What is my responsibility to humanity in general? Like, it's just it's a rough question. And I don't know that we've figured out how to live in this like media landscape that we're in.
It's interesting. It gets to what you were saying about Tracy Flick, about her perception of herself as victim or active agent. I remember reading Mulan Kundera because a lot of his characters, things happen to them, bad things happen to them, because they were living in, an autocratic state. And he talked about how it changed the nature of narrative, and I think it just occurred to me that that's essentially what you're saying, whether you're a witness, a bystander, or bad things are happening to you. We suddenly reach this blurry line in our history, I think, where we kind of view ourselves as bystanders, except a lot of stuff is happening.
Yeah, no, I think, and there are some, writers who are really making that the focus, like Tony Tuoltimudi's book, Rejection, just these people are just so steeped in this sort of online world. It's like realer to them than the world that they step out into, or, Patricia Lockwood too. There's just a language and a way of thinking that comes with having your consciousness be shaped by all this information and imagery that's coming through, the digital space.
Well, we'll end on that heavy note, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
We'll be right back with today's Substackin'.
Brooke, I've talked to a lot of writers recently who are struggling with writing in these challenging, uncertain, and just downright disturbing times. So I want to highlight a couple of my recent Substacks that focused on ways to keep writing and the reasons to keep writing, and one in particular that focused on writing in times of trauma. And my newsletter titled Prompting Stories, it focused on my friend Meg Pokras's newsletter, which is called Prompts of Resilience. And Meg is a wonderful flash fiction writer, and she's become somewhat famous for her writing prompts. And she'll present a kind of goofy photo and then list 7 words to try to use in your story. And she sometimes sends her newsletter prompt to writers like me and then publishes the story they write as part of her newsletter. So she actually sent me a challenge and asked me to use 3 of the 7 words she gave me. And then the photo was this crazy vintage photo of a clown dancing with a woman that I found really quite touching. And so I ended up using 5 words. And, I was thinking about prompts because I use prompts when I teach, but I almost never write to prompts myself. But I found this exercise just so super fun. And I was thinking about why it was so good, especially for writing in these times where I'm feeling a little bit stuck too. And one, because it was an invitation to break my routine for a different form of writing. And then it was just so playful that it reminded me how writing could be fun. And I needed that reminder. And the challenge to use the different words was especially fun because each time I tried to use one, it essentially opened up a whole new doorway to a whole different story, which was also super fun. So Brooke, I'm curious, do you write or teach with prompts? And if you teach with them, I'm curious if you have any favorites for memoir.
I don't explicitly use prompts, but I think about and talk about prompts in my classes. So that's not totally true because a couple of the classes that I teach will have prompts, or we'll design some of our 6-week classes that might have a writing prompt attached to it. Mm-hmm. So one of the favorites that I have around dialogue, just supporting writers to think about dialogue, is to get yourself into an argument with someone, right? Like something that really happened, an argument that you can recall, and just use dialogue and body language and, character tags, all of the things that really bring alive a scene of action that is that's explicitly an argument. So that's one that I really like for memoirists. Another one is just about recalling a room from your childhood home and describing it. That's really about prompting detail, memory from the past, because memoir is particular in that it really happened. It's unlike novels in that way. And so writers sometimes struggle with the details and the memories and how to write things. But I will say that there are lots and lots and lots of access to writing prompts. And so I'll say to my memoirists, go online, search for prompts. And that's particularly if and when they get stuck. So I appreciate that you're talking about having a lot of fun. The stalled out piece and sort of the pressure to work on the piece that you have is oftentimes what stalls people out. And so I think more than anything, writing prompts can shake things up. They can make you think about things in a different way. And like you said, they can really get you unstuck.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Brooke. And I want to share one more writing prod, which I discussed in another issue of my newsletter. And I've taken a lot of inspiration recently from my friend, the wonderful artist Isa Kato, who lost her daughter Bailey to an accidental overdose of fentanyl last summer. And basically a friend in quotation marks, gave her drugs laced with fentanyl, and she died in her sleep. And really tragic death, obviously. And Isa's been really so bravely forthcoming about the many shapes her grieving has taken in her Substack newsletter, which is called This Slant of Light. And one of Isa's ways to grieve is to make a mixed media featuring a butterfly each day to remember Bailey. And the beckoning of the ritual each day kind of helps her both grieve and also create, because she's viewing creating as like her pathway to life, essentially. And she said, or she writes in her newsletter, butterflies were a logical choice, beautiful and fleeting like she was, but they also represent immortality, the souls of the departed, and reinvention across a myriad of cultures. And I think her ritual of doing this every day is really instructive for us all when we're feeling daunted by the disturbing quality of the world or our lives. And Isa wrote, she said, I needed a practice I could perform on autopilot to jumpstart each day. With the help of a friend's candle and some preternatural survival instinct, I have a map with simple navigational points that nudge me forward, will me to seek beauty, and insist that I will fall fully, madly back in love with this life again. I think that's such a powerful quote.
It's such a hard story to hear, and also so brave of her to look at art as a way to get through the darkness and back to falling in love with this life. And it's powerful because, you know, all of us, I think, are facing losses in different ways. You know, it might be very personal or it might be quite global. And I wanted to note that she mentioned being inspired by Casper ter Kuile, the power of ritual, turning everyday activities into soulful practices. And just that she writes that according to this author, rituals help us create critical connections during times of isolation and anguish. And so that's a big one. You know, I think people are looking for something to sort of lean into during hard times, and ritual is something great and important that we all have access to.
Definitely, and creating rituals for our art or our writing. And I heard a psychologist once say that unless we name trauma, we are powerless to transform it. You know, it remains an antagonist and an enemy. So I really think we need to stay creative and put our voices into the world, both as a way to buoy ourselves, but also just to feel the power of our voices in this world. So listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to create that creative fuel for you each week on Right Minded. So please tune in next week.